Hi, I'm John Horn, the host of The Frame on KPCC. I'm your moderator for today's half hour with, and I'm happy to introduce you to our panelists for today, producer, director, and writer of the documentary film, The Dissident, of Icarus fame, Bryan Fogel. Bryan, welcome.
Hey, John. Great to be speaking with you again.
So before we talk about The Dissident, I'm going to show a clip from the film and then we'll dive right in. So let's take a look at this.
Ancak 15 Ekim tarihinde biz arama, inceleme, delil toplama, iz ve amarelere bakma imkanını bulabildik.
Toplantı odasında olduğunu öngörüyoruz elde ettiğimiz bulgulardan yola çıkarak. Dışarıya kapalı bir oda. İçeriye girdik. Hani bazen bir yere gidersiniz ve burası çok temiz kokuyor dersiniz.
İşte biz de bilmiyoruz ne olduğunu için örnek alıyoruz. They don't know either. They want to take sample because of this.
We'll check with the general, okay?
Okay. No, everything will be asked general first.
Hey, okay.
Before taking samples, we are just notifying you where they take samples.
Suudi Arabistanlı yetkilinin yüzündeki ifadeyi görmenizi isterdim. Çünkü şaşırdı, bu ne der gibi. O toplantı odasını tesadüfen seçmediler. O odanın özellikle seçilmiş olması kendi ülkeleriyle bir bağlantı içerisinde oldukları senaryosunu doğurmamızı sağladı. Öncesinde, belki sırasında, olay anında ve sonrasında. Birileri tüm olup biteni rahatlıkla seyretmiş, hatta talimatlar vermiş olabilir.
So Bryan, before we talk about the content of the film, I want to ask you, based on that clip, it almost feels like you are editing and mixing and scoring this as if it's like a Jason Bourne narrative drama. When you were thinking about how you're going to structure the film and what it's going to feel like, were you thinking more about narrative film than documentary film?
You know, I guess the answer is yes, absolutely. You know, myself and my creative team, I think, especially with how we structured Icarus, and again, with The Dissident, I believe that there's real power and impact in being able to create an emotional response that, you know, as I would call it, you know, great cinematic storytellers, the Paul Greengrasses of the world, are able to elicit from their audiences.
I think it's fair to say that Icarus was a movie that changed dramatically in the middle of its making. It started out as this film about you going on what I'll call the Lance Armstrong diet to see how that might improve your racing on a bike, to this expose of state-sponsored doping in Russian sports. Was there a similar path within The Dissident that maybe you started to make one film and it changed course? And if you were to describe how that path evolved in the making of the film, what would you say the developmental shifts were as you went along interviewing people and putting the film together?
Well, unlike you know, Icarus, where Icarus started and where it ended up 3 years later, I truly could have not foreseen at the time. I mean, I'd set out to make a film initially that in my mind was going to show that the anti-doping system in sport was a fraud by using myself as a guinea pig to prove that. I certainly couldn't have imagined that, you know, a year and a half into making Icarus, that I would essentially, through Gregory Rodchenkov, uncover the biggest scandal in Olympic and sporting history, help to bring that story public and then document the fallout from that. In the case of The Dissident, from the outset, I had a clear direction, which was I wanted to make a film, essentially, as I saw it, as the untold story behind the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And what I mean by the untold story is that what was being presented in a lot of media, both Western media and otherwise, was that Jamal was Muslim Brotherhood, that he was a terrorist sympathizer, that he was an ISIS supporter. And none of these allegations were true. And I wanted to shine a light behind this murder in a way that I felt that a film could, outside the pages of news. What I guess transpired in the making of this film was over a year of trust building between myself, his fiancee Hatice Cengiz, Omar Abdulaziz, the Saudi dissident living in self-exile, who Jamal was secretly working with, and the Turkish authorities, investigators, prosecutors, presidential spokesperson, intelligence officers, forensic examiners that were investigating the murder, that ultimately decided to allow me access and exclusive evidence and interviews to help craft the story and assemble the film.
So much of the story in The Dissident is about mistrust and about how people say one thing and do another, how they can't be relied upon. And obviously, that's a concern that people who are close to this story might have when an American journalist and documentary filmmaker is approaching them. So, in the case of Omar, and in the case of Hatice, in the case of the Turkish authorities, what was your pitch to them? What was the thing that you told them to try to gain their trust? And were there certain steps that you went through to make sure that they knew who you were and what you were out to do?
When Saudi Arabia had in fact confessed that Jamal had indeed died inside that consulate, that this had the makings of the film, a story that I wanted to tell. But what hinged on being able to do that was getting the trust of the key people in that story. I got in touch with Hatice through an intermediary. We spoke in the weeks following his murder, and while she was grieving, she invited me to come to meet her in Istanbul. And I was in Istanbul, I believe it was around the first week of November, and spent the next 5 weeks there where we weren't filming. I didn't bring cameras, I didn't bring a crew. And during those 5-6 weeks of time, I returned back to the US right after Christmas. We met on multiple occasions. And in each time that we met, I said to her, look, I can't imagine what you are going through. I don't think anyone can. But I do know that I believe that somebody needs to tell this story. And if you will trust me to help you do that, I promise you that I will do everything in my power to not only protect you, but to help to fight for Jamal's legacy. About 3 months after that initial meeting, Hatice agreed to let me begin filming with her as she spoke in front of the European Parliament in February of 2019. And that began our next year together. And, she's now like a sister to me. With the Turks, it was a similar situation where I spent weeks and the better part of a year gaining trust slowly. And I was allowed access to one thing, but then I needed to meet with somebody else to get access to another thing. Going back and forth between Istanbul and Ankara, I ended up spending about 7 months in Turkey in 2019. And the majority of that time there, again, I wasn't filming. It was meeting after meeting, coffee after coffee, meal after meal, where I would meet different government officials. And each time I would say, look, I'm not here to disparage Turkey. I'm here to shine light on the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And if you work with me and provide me with your evidence, I promise I will do my best um, to tell that story. And the same thing with Omar. So it was a very long process in building trust with people that were either, suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, as in the case of Omar and Atija, this horrendous event, or in dealing with the government and their intelligence operations and their investigation to have an outsider, a Westerner, an American, granted access um, across the board.
There are two people essentially at the center of this story. One is Jamal. The other one is Mohammed bin Salman, Saudi Arabia's crown prince. And I want to read something from a Washington Post editorial that was published on the second anniversary of Jamal Khashoggi's murder. And this is what the Post wrote in an editorial. During all that time, two facts have remained unchanged. There has been no justice for those who ordered and orchestrated his killing, and Mohammed bin Salman, Saudi Arabia's crown prince and de facto ruler, has sustained the brutal repression that has made his regime the cruelest and most criminal in the country's modern history. And since that was published, the G20 was held virtually in Riyadh, and a number of world leaders attended. And the last couple of days, Benjamin Netanyahu had a secret meeting with Mohammed bin Salman, I guess under the theory, an enemy of my enemy is my friend, meaning he's an enemy of Iran, as is Israel. So it doesn't feel like what has been uncovered in your film, what other people have reported, has in any way affected the standing of Mohammed bin Salman.
I wouldn't even call it shocking, but distressing, upsetting, is to see this level of criminality, to be able to orchestrate such a brutal and horrific murder on top of, I believe, the 800 or 900 beheadings in Saudi Arabia last year. Most of these people who were beheaded were young activists who did nothing more than send a tweet. On top of the countless thousands and thousands of people and women sitting in Saudi jails without charges, simply for advocating for freedom of press, freedom of speech in their country. And to see this level of human rights violations, and at the same time, not only all members of the G20 being willing to continue to do business and increase their business relationships with Saudi Arabia, but of course, what we're seeing, out of Israel, who actually sold them cybersecurity software through the NSO group Pegasus, which allowed them to hack the phones of people like Jamal and Omar, that, as you'll see in the film, ultimately led to Jamal's murder. But also to see the cowardice among the major American and global media organizations and corporations that did not step up to acquire the film or to distribute the film, and have even since come forward announcing deals with Saudi Arabia, both in the case of Amazon acquiring Souk, the Saudi Arabia of Amazon, and a Netflix announcing an 8-slate deal with a Saudi Arabian film production company, which of course that's all part of the government. So we see this across the board, that essentially the money and the business interests outweigh any sense of accountability for human rights, freedom, justice, or accountability for such a horrific crime against a journalist who did nothing more or nothing wrong other than to advocate for freedom of press and some form of parliamentary democracy in his country.
And I think that came around to the film itself. I mean, I think it's fair to say that Dissident was one of the best reviewed documentaries at this year's Sundance Film Festival. And Netflix, a company that, you won an Oscar for with Icarus, didn't buy the film. Amazon didn't. Apple didn't. Apple has a new store in Riyadh. When you start thinking about the business interests that those companies have, obviously Briarcliff came in, and they probably don't have exposure to Saudi Arabia right now. But is that something that you also felt, that there was an unspoken fear of Saudi Arabia in terms of what potential distributors were afraid about if they acquired the film.
What has happened over the last few years is, these global streaming giants that are able to distribute in every country in the world or in major territories. The size and scope of these companies has also led to cowardice, fear, and backing away from what could be considered controversial content, because the aim is now to please all rather than to please some. And look, and you can take this equation into doing business with China, where these companies such as Disney have never taken a stand or will change content or will literally, make editorial changes at the behest of the Chinese government, or with ESPN and the NBA and their dealings with China, or what's been happening in Hong Kong and China. And what you're seeing is just a consistent across the board cowardice to take on these authoritarian dictatorship regimes, provided that these countries have money and that there's business to be had. And unfortunately, filmmakers such as myself can no longer rely on these companies to distribute content that we know the world wants to see. We know, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people around the globe have interest in a story like this. But due to their own financial interests, shareholder value, internal concerns, security risks assessment, etc., films like this are being silenced outside of independent distribution. And for that reason, I'm incredibly grateful to Tom Ortenberg and Briarcliff Entertainment. Tom has a record of taking on hard films such as Spotlight, Crash, Fahrenheit 9/11. We have an incredible distributor in the UK, Altitude, which again has taken on, incredible films, documentaries, and features. In the past, a wonderful distributor in Australia. And what we're finding is that independent distributors are willing to take the film on. And, unfortunately, COVID has put a damper in many of our distribution plans. But I'm very grateful that the film is going to be able to see the light of day, despite the greed and cowardice of these major media companies.
This is a movie, obviously, about the murder of a critic of Saudi Arabia, but it's also a movie about social media. And the last time I checked, I think Saudi Arabia had about 34 million people as its population, and about 30.4 million people who use a mobile phone. I mean, I don't know if that's counting, 2-year-olds or what, but this is a country that has a huge presence in social media and through mobile phones. And as I mentioned, Apple has a new store in Riyadh. The control of social media as a government propaganda tool and the way it's used by dissenters is a central part of this story and how they go after those people. So how did that story start to become part of the core of the documentary that you wanted to tell? And what was your takeaway from what you learned about social media inside Saudi Arabia?
Well, I think a lot of what you're talking about also backtracks into the conversation about, major media companies and corporations being fearful of the film, which is that, Saudi Arabia, the vast majority of the country is getting their news and information from Twitter. And the reason why that is because of all these social media platforms. Twitter is the one that is the most unregulated, meaning you can go and create an account under, Joe Smith 11154, and that can be your Twitter handle. You can create 50 Twitter handles. And so it becomes a very difficult platform to regulate. And if you're using a VPN, you can also appear that your Twitter stream is coming from a different country. So in the case of Saudi Arabia, you have millions and millions of people being able to communicate with each other without government interference on Twitter. The caveat to that is what Saudi Arabia has done is employ tens of thousands of people, Saudis, to basically push forward a false narrative on Twitter, to basically create fake tweets, fake hashtags, create fake trending, to basically support the government narrative, the government objective, and of course, MBS's popularity. And anybody who is dissenting that, those tweets get quashed or suppressed. That is what Jamal Khashoggi and Omar Abdulaziz was working on, basically a campaign to suppress Saudi Arabia's false bots, I guess you would call it, of taking over Twitter. But this speaks to the importance of these social media platforms in Saudi Arabia and why the government is so interested in being able to control them. And this is such a primary objective that in the case of Jamal Khashoggi, they were willing to murder or arrest or behead people, literally that have the courage to take on their social media objectives.
I've seen this movie twice. I'm curious what your pitch is to people who haven't yet seen it that would tell them, drop what you're doing, check out this movie because it's important. What is your elevator pitch to those people who haven't yet watched it, and I would argue need to watch it?
This is a film that people need to see, and they need to see it because not only is this a film that the major media companies and members of the G20 don't really want you to see. This is a film that serves to enlighten you about the world that you live in, what is going on in human rights violations, in the suppression of freedom of speech and journalism, and ultimately the murder of someone who was moderate and brave enough to speak out. And films like this help to enlighten, help to change the world. If those that see a film like this choose to take action, and much like the Arab Spring got its roots through Twitter, through social engagement, the same can be said from the Me Too movement. The same can be said from the BLM movement, and the same can be said from revolutions, social revolutions, political revolutions, or otherwise. That it's the people and their knowledge and power that ultimately can influence decision and direction. And I believe that a film like this can impact that. So I would encourage anybody that cares about subject matter like this to watch it.
I'm going to talk about another audience that probably hasn't seen the film, and it probably should, and that is the citizens of Saudi Arabia. I know no filmmaker really openly wishes that his film or her film is pirated, but let's just hope that maybe, and I apologize to Briarcliff right now, that this film does make its way by hook or by crook into Saudi Arabia. What do you hope that the people of Saudi Arabia can take away from this film, no matter how it gets in? Because I suspect it's going to get in somehow.
Well, to that extent, my partners on this film and the backers of this film were the Human Rights Foundation and Thor Halvorson. And Gary Kasparov is its CEO. And without the Human Rights Foundation, I would have not been able to make this film. I mean, they got behind not only the making of the film, but helping in the marketing and P&A of this film to see to it that it would have a voice. And to that extent, the Human Rights Foundation has launched many campaigns, one of which was disseminating tens of thousands of thumb drives into North Korea for them to see the interview, the Seth Rogen film. So I know that is their intention with the Dissident to do a similar guerrilla campaign with Saudi Arabia to see to it that people can see the film and that hopefully it will be shared. The motivations for Human Rights Foundation are not financial. It's to basically fight for human rights, and if it wasn't for their charitable donors, this film wouldn't come into an existence. So there is a strategy in place for that, and And that is the primary objective behind the film, which is to shine light, fight against human rights abuses, and hopefully fight for justice for Jamal, but also the thousands and thousands of imprisoned Saudis who have done nothing more than to tweet or speak out against their government or voice an opinion that doesn't align with Mohammed bin Salman's.
There's one quick question from the audience before we wrap up, and that is the person who refuses to leave the White House is quoted in Bob Woodward's book saying that he, quote, saved his ass in reference to Mohammed bin Salman. I think we know that a new administration is coming in. So the second part of this question is, what might a new Biden administration do in terms of its approach to Saudi Arabia that perhaps has been missing for the past 4 years?
Well, interestingly enough, when I went with Hatice Cengiz to follow and document her time in Washington, we met with senators and congressmen across the aisle, both Republicans and Democrats, and we found, literally unanimous bipartisan support for justice and accountability, not only for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, but in blocking weapons sales to Yemen and reassessing the US-Saudi relationship, our reliance on Saudi oil, etc., and the financial ties between the US and Saudi, which has gotten in the way of these human rights abuses that should be sanctioned and punished. And we found that, from whether it was Nancy Pelosi or whether it was Lindsey Graham, whether it was Mitch McConnell or whether it was Adam Schiff, literally across the board. And what Biden has said, and he made a statement just on October 2nd of 2020, just a little over a month ago on the second anniversary of Jamal Khashoggi's murder, he put forward a statement saying that if he was elected president, that one of his objectives would be to take a very hard look at the US-Saudi relation, and that he was committed to working to seek justice for Jamal. So, I guess it's to be determined, but it appears that the Biden administration at least has an appetite to look into the US-Saudi relationship and perhaps enact some sort of sanctions or take some sort of action that might be meaningful.
Bryan, I want to thank you for sharing your time with us and also your partners at Briarcliff Entertainment. I also want to thank you for making this very important film. And I urge everybody who hasn't yet seen it to see it. And those who've seen it, watch it again and recommend it to friends. So, Bryan, best of luck. And to all of you who are watching from your couch, from your living room, from your patio, wherever you are,